They attacked Berdichev.
Berdichev,
what?
What part of the country is it, Or
Which
where?
part of Ukraine is it?
City.
Berdichev?
Berdichev, it's southeast.
Southeast.
Yeah.
Oh, southeast, maybe.
Southeast it could be.
Yeah, so I haven't heard if they attacked it, but Berdichev is one of the most famous cities in the world for Jews, because that's where one of the greatest rabbis of all times lived, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. He was known for his love of God, love of his fellow, love of Torah, love of the mitzvot. He was just a heart with little legs, if you would have to draw a picture of him. And when he was at the end of his life, he was very weak and fragile. And Yom Kippur is a fast day, and he fasted. He wouldn't think of taking anything, even though his life was pretty precarious. And after Yom Kippur was over, when you don't eat or drink, he said, "I'm thirsty, I'm famished, I'm thirsty." So they ran to the kitchen, they brought him a glass of water, they put it down, and he opened up a volume of the Talmud, and he ignored the water. So they thought, okay, he'll take it in a few minutes. A half hour or hour later, "Oh yeah, I'm so thirsty." And they brought another glass of water, but the first one wasn't even, and this went on all night long. At the end of the night and early in the morning, he hadn't broken his fast, he hadn't taken any water, but he closed the volume of the Talmud. He was studying the tractate of the Talmud that deals with the holiday of Sukkot, the next holiday. So they said, "What happened? You said you were thirsty." He says, "Thirsty for water? No, thirsty for Torah. My whole Yom Kippur I was praying, so I didn't have time to study. So I had such thirst, I couldn't get enough of it." So he started the volume, which is 110 pages, and all night long he went through the entire volume, which is a very major intellectual accomplishment. That's an example of the pleasure, the joy that a person could experience in learning Torah. And I know people who have that joy. But even so, which is a positive thing, minimize. In other words, don't get carried away with just the pleasure. Torah transcends your pleasure, your desire for pleasure, even the most spiritual and positive pleasure. That's possibly what he means. But then I would add another interpretation. Perhaps you should have more joy and less pleasure. What's the difference between joy and pleasure? Maybe many differences, but this is the way I understand it. Joy means you're happy. Someone tells you good news, someone tells you the war is over, you're happy. Pleasure is a term, the Hebrew form of it is used for the Shabbat. Shabbat is a time of oneg Shabbat, delight, pleasure. What's the difference? Shabbat is the end of the week, when you're able to feel accomplishment. In other words, you have a task at hand, and you accomplish the task, and you sit back and you say, I feel so good, I'm mission accomplished, I did what I was supposed to do. That's pleasure as opposed to being happy. You could be happy even if you didn't finish your task, and you can have pleasure even though you're not happy, but you have pleasure, you just feel delight. What is he trying to say over here? That when you learn, and let's say you've finished an entire volume of the Talmud, don't feel too much pleasure. I'm satisfied, I finished my task. No, you're not finished. Turn the page to the next volume. You never sit back, although it doesn't say you shouldn't have any pleasure, but minimize the pleasure. Recognize that there's no end to this learning. You're never going to be fully satisfied. The Rabbi would very often encourage people to do more good, build things, and spread Judaism, spread goodness and kindness. And once a person did a tremendous thing, I don't remember exactly what he did, but he made a major achievement, and he told the Rebbe about it, and the Rebbe said, "When are you going to do the next project?" So he said to the Rebbe, "Are you not happy with what I did?" He says, "I'm very happy, but I'm not satisfied." In other words, when it comes to doing good, you should be happy about it, but never feel this tremendous contentment as if mission accomplished, that I already finished, and I'm at the end of my mission. That may be what he means by minimizing the pleasure. Okay, minimum of sleep. Maimonides writes that a person should sleep 8 hours a night, a third of the night. I doubt very much that he kept what he prescribed for others. But most of the famous scholars and sages are not known to have slept very much. The Rabbi probably didn't sleep more than 2-3 hours a night and was able to stay up days on end with activity and not sleeping. Obviously, he would never recommend that to anyone else. The Rebbe did not practice what he preached. He would always preach, don't indulge in sleeplessness, don't fast, don't torture your body. But he did that to himself. So he didn't practice what he preached in that regard. But a minimum of sleep means not you shouldn't sleep. Of course, your body needs a certain amount of sleep and it's unhealthy. But don't indulge in sleep. The maximum is 8 hours. And Maimonides quotes the Talmud that the nighttime is the best time to learn because there are no distractions. Daytime is filled with distractions, although nowadays we have instruments that bring the knowledge of what's going on in the world 24/7, and the night can sometimes be as distracting as day. But generally speaking, nighttime people are sleeping, everyone is retired, so now you can really focus on your learning in a way that you couldn't during the day. So whenever you can minimize your sleep in a healthful way, do that. Next one is a minimum of conversation. What does that mean? Don't engage in idle talk. That's number one. It goes without saying that you shouldn't engage in forbidden talk. What's forbidden talk? Gossip, speaking ill of others. That's forbidden talk. Vulgar language is forbidden talk. I know today they say it's good to get it out of your system. It's healthy to use 4-letter words, and it's not healthy. It's very unhealthy. It pollutes you. It contaminates you. It degrades you, and it's something that you shouldn't do. Not just in public. I know society makes a distinction between public and private. Public officials, if they say something unclean in public, they get skewered for it. But if they do it in private, it's acceptable. No, it shouldn't be acceptable in any form. Person's tongue should be clean. So that goes without saying that no forbidden talk should be eliminated. But even when you're talking words of Torah, you should try to be succinct. The Talmud says that a teacher should make sure that when he teaches, he's clear, that the students understand. And if he speaks flowery language and he's poetic and he waxes eloquent and everything, it might be nice. I remember I once heard Abi Ibn speak for an hour, and he was enthralling. He was mesmerizing. I never heard a speaker like that. His command of English and the way he was a wordsmith was incredible. But after the hour was over, if someone asked me, what did he say? I have no idea. I have no idea. He didn't impart a message to me that I could take with me. Because maybe he did say something, but it just didn't register. An hour worth of talk. You can speak 5 hours and be succinct, and you can speak 5 minutes and just speak a lot, but not say anything of meaningful. So a minimum of conversation means even when you're teaching something good and positive, try to make it clear. I hope I'm doing that. If I'm not, you have to stop me. Another possible way of explaining this, of minimizing speech. Speech is often used as a metaphor for prayer. One of the original prayers was the one of the patriarch Isaac. It says, Yetze Yitzchak lasuach basada. Isaac went out to speak, to converse in the field. And that's understood to mean that he prayed. And that's why we have the afternoon prayer, because it was in the afternoon when Isaac went out to pray. But the word for prayer is used to speak, because that's where we converse with God. What is prayer? Prayer is where we're standing before God and saying, God, how are you doing today? I'm doing fine, or maybe not so fine. Could you help me? It's a conversation with God. There's a Hasidic group called the Breslov, and they have this custom that in addition to their regular prayers, they go out into the fields or wherever they can be secluded, and they have a conversation with God. They're talking to God as if they're talking to their father, to their friend. And they feel this intimacy between them and God. Not everyone has that custom, but the idea is always there in prayer. Prayer is conversation. If you want to acquire truth, the ratio between prayer and study should be in favor of the study. The study is more important than the prayer. Now that sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but the Talmud puts it this way. The Talmud says when you're dealing with prayer, prayer is usually about asking for your needs. That's what the Amidah, the most important prayer, asking for all your needs. It's about you. It's about your needs. And it's very important because it's not just about you personally, it's about everyone collectively. But it's about needs, physical, material needs. Torah is about eternal life. Torah is divine wisdom. Torah is where God is speaking to us. There's a difference between, people say, we can all speak to God, but does God talk back to you? And if you say yes, we have a place where they lock these people up, if you think God is speaking to you. But the truth is, God does speak to us when we study Torah. Every time we study Torah, which we're doing right now, it says God is actually saying the words with us. He's right here with us, and he's repeating those words. So if you say something stupid, you're putting stupid words in God's mouth. That's not very nice. So we have to have a respect for Torah, that it's not just intellectual, cerebral, it's a spiritual relationship. It's a love letter that God is sending us and communicating with us, because it's God's words that we're saying when we study Torah. And again, Torah does not just mean the 5 books of Moses. Torah means all of Jewish knowledge that is based on the 5 books of Moses. So maybe that's what he means over here, a minimum of conversation, that even with regard to prayer, which is very, very holy, and not only holy, but required, but the ratio should be a little bit more on the Torah than on the prayer. Then he goes on a minimum of laughter. He doesn't say you shouldn't laugh. The Talmud, I think we mentioned in an earlier class, says clearly that people who cause other people to laugh are destined to go into paradise. Causing people, bringing joy to people. Comedians are doing a very positive thing if their comedy is clean, if their comedy is not vulgar, if their comedy is uplifting rather than degrading. So humor is not a bad thing, but also the rabbis use humor. The Talmud says he was the greatest rabbi of his time. His name was Rabbi, and when he would sit in his lecture hall, the students were like in such awe of him that they couldn't listen to anything he would say. They were just terrified, not terrified in a bad way, but just awestricken. So he would crack a joke, and everyone would laugh. And then they were able to absorb what he would teach. He used humor to break the ice. So humor is a positive thing. But you know what? Some people can get carried away with humor, that all they do is joke. That's not going to be productive in terms of learning. The next one is slow to anger. What does this mean? It means, number one, not to lose patience. Sometimes the teacher loses patience when students don't grasp the lesson. I'm sure we all had teachers who were very impatient when we were kids, that if you asked too many questions, they would get upset. If you didn't understand, and they said, let me repeat myself, and you still didn't understand, they would get angry at you. They would explode at you. Well, obviously, that's not going to be a way to teach. And it's not a way to learn either. If a student who is criticized by the teacher, and the student becomes irate, and the student gets angry, he's also not going to learn. She's also not going to absorb anything. So we're not talking about anger in the sense of, generally speaking, angry people are not are not good people, or not receptive to learning. And we're talking about even in the process of learning, you should control your anger. And who is the greatest person that ever lived? Moses. And he got angry. And he forgot his learning, the Talmud says. There was a war, and there were some questions about certain things about that war. And they asked, and Moses got upset at the people because they didn't follow instructions, and he didn't know what the law was. And they had to get the information from someone else. So the Talmud tells us that when you get angry, the Shekhinah, the divine presence, departs from you. And if it departs from you, the knowledge that he only would have had because of his prophetic abilities, his spiritual constitution, he lost that and he forgot his learning. Anger, even when it's justified, is unhealthy, spiritually unhealthy, and intellectually unhealthy for the person. The next one is a good heart. What does a good heart mean? Literally, a person who's a kind person. Why is kindness better for you to absorb knowledge? You would think kindness is a positive virtue, no question about it, but why is kindness something that makes you a better student? You can be a nasty person, a very unkind person, you can still be brilliant. We know some brilliant scientists who are not nice people, but they were still brilliant. But when it comes to Torah, Torah is different. Torah requires sensitivity. You have to have a sensitive soul. If you don't have a sensitive soul, then you're not receptive to Torah. Because Torah, again, repeating myself over and over, because this is the central theme over here, Torah is divine knowledge. That's why it's truth. Only things that are divine can be absolutely true. Everything else has truth mixed into it, but it's not absolutely truth. Something that comes from God is absolutely true. People who are committed to God are more truthful, not just that they don't lie, but they're consistent. There's a consistency to their lives. But in order to be receptive to divine knowledge, you have to have sensitivity yourself. You have to have a sensitive soul to pick up the nuances in Torah. Yes, you can be an insensitive person and get the idea, but the nuances, the between the lines, there's some information there that you have to be sensitive in order to pick it up. And then in a practical way, very often when you're discussing a subject with someone, and that person comes up with an idea that's a very good idea, but it wasn't your idea, and you don't like that. You don't feel good about yourself and about that person, because why didn't I think of that idea? Why is that person smarter than me? And you feel that you're not going to embrace what that person said just because it was someone else who said it. So you knock what that person said and you say, what you said is nonsense. There's a Yiddish expression called farginen. There's no English word for it to translate it. To fargin someone is to feel good that the other person was successful. Let's say in your job you didn't do very well, but you hear that your friend did very well in the same thing. Well, how do you feel? You feel, if only that person failed as well, I wouldn't feel so bad about myself. That's a bad human trait, but that's a trait that people suffer from. Fargin means that you enjoy, you feel good about the other person's success. So if someone calls you up when you're miserable and says, I just won the lottery, you said, oh, thank God, I'm so happy that you won the lottery, and you really mean it. That's called farginning. There's no English word. I can't think of an English word for that. You don't begrudge the person, but it's stronger than just not begrudging. It's a distinctive Yiddish word. There's no Hebrew word for it either. The Hebrew used the Yiddish, lefargen. They use the same word. So that's what he means by a good heart. If you really want to learn Torah, not just learn any subject, you have to fargin. You have to not begrudge the other person, feel good about the other person's successes, and then you become more receptive to knowledge. Literally, you're not going to reject it out of hand because it's someone else's idea. I know people, anything you say, they'll say the opposite. No matter what you say, they'll say the opposite. They're contrarians. That's their nature. That's not receptive to acquiring truth. The next one is faith in the sages. The sages are the rabbis who transmitted the oral Torah from Moses down to our generation. Moses transmitted the Torah to Joshua, not just to Joshua, but he was the main one. Joshua to the elders to the prophets to the men of the Great Assembly. The men of the Great Assembly, it goes down from one generation to another to this day. Faith in the sages means that you believe, as the Torah says, that God entrusted the knowledge to the sages. Well, how do you qualify as a sage? What do you have to do to qualify as a sage? Number one, you have to be educated. You have to be knowledgeable of the subject. But that's perhaps the smallest of the conditions. You have to be someone who's known to practice their knowledge meticulously. People who are not just very knowledgeable, but are scrupulously committed to every little detail of what they teach. And not like the politicians that are leaders, but they're leaders who practice who preach one thing and practice differently. No, they practice what they preach, and not only that, they're more careful about what they preach than the people to whom they preach. They'll be more permissive when someone else doesn't do everything right than they would be on themselves. They're more harsh on themselves than they are on others. That's number two. So the knowledge, the implementation of the knowledge in their behavior. Number three, the people who indulge in spiritual things. They're not materialistic. They're not hedonistic. Their focus is just on knowledge and spirituality. And they're also humble. If you see a great rabbinic scholar who's all full of himself, he could be the greatest mind, no one's going to listen to him. I shouldn't say no one. There'll be plenty of people who will get ensnare, but that's not someone you want to listen to. Someone who is there was once, I'm not going to mention any names, of course, but a very great scholar, Rabbi, who was a character witness for someone in a court. And when the lawyer asked him, Rabbi, what are your credentials? He says, I am the greatest Talmudic scholar in all of whichever country it is. And the judge was taken aback, and the judge looks at him and says, Rabbi, what about humility? Your Honor, I'm under oath. I have to tell the truth. It's very hard to be a student of such a teacher who's all full of himself. A teacher also has to be prepared to say, number five, this is part of your modesty and humility, to say, I'm wrong, I made a mistake. We would often hear the Rabbi criticize us for not correcting him. He said, I made a mistake and you didn't correct me. And he was very upset why he wasn't corrected, why people didn't point out his mistake. Great sages are the people who have all these qualities: the knowledge, the implication of the knowledge in their lives, their humility, but also they're the link to Mount Sinai. The Torah was given to us at Mount Sinai and transmitted orally, even after the Talmud was put into writing, which was part of the oral tradition. Jews never lost their connection to their previous generation. We always had, there are no such thing as total autodidacts, people who learn on their own. While they learn on their own, they also have teachers that they go to. And their teachers connect them to the earlier generation. So there's an unbroken chain of tradition all the way back to Mount Sinai. And when we have faith, the Torah tells us this is in the 5 books of Moses, that whenever you have a question, you go to the sages, and whatever they tell you, don't deviate from what they say, don't go right or left. But what happens if they make a mistake? So the Talmud has a whole tractate, a whole volume What happens if the rabbis make a mistake? Once they make the mistake, there's a special type of offering in the temple to atone for their mistake. In other words, no one is saying that the rabbis are infallible, but we're told to follow them as long as they qualify as a sage until it can be proven that they were wrong. And then they themselves will admit it and deal with atoning for it. But until we prove that they were wrong, we have faith in their words because God endowed them with this divine knowledge, this divine inspiration. The next one is acceptance of suffering. Suffering is a very difficult subject to discuss, and it needs a lot more time than I'm going to devote to it now. Judaism it has a paradoxical view of suffering in life. On one hand, we do everything in our power to minimize other people's suffering and our own suffering. No person who is in pain and can take a medication to get rid of the pain and says, no, I'd rather suffer, that's not a virtue. I'm not going to get into the subject whether the painkiller is healthy for you, you'll get addicted to it, that's a separate issue. But I'm saying the idea that I'd rather suffer, which a lot of Jewish mothers have done, they'd rather suffer than get rid of the suffering, that's not necessarily a virtue. We don't celebrate suffering as an end. But on the other side of the coin, once a person does endure suffering, it's a very positive experience. It's a cleansing, a cathartic experience. It cleanses the person, it elevates the person, and purifies the person. So if you ask a person, do you want to suffer? Would you want more suffering? No, of course not. But once you went through that suffering, you should realize that it had a positive effect. The previous Lubavitcher Rebbe was tortured by the communists, and he had terrible suffering, unbearable suffering for a long time. And he once remarked, he said, for all the money in the world, whatever you could give me, I would not tolerate another second of that suffering. But then he said, for all the money in the world, I won't give up any of my suffering. I cherished all of my suffering that I went through. So while he recognized that suffering is horrible and you should eschew it, you should just run away from it, once it happens to you, appreciate, or even, God forbid, while a person is suffering, part of the person should be able to say, I don't want it, God, take it away from me, but as long as I have it, I hope it does affect and cleanse me and make me a better person. So, acceptance of suffering is one of the conditions to absorbing Torah. It says in the Talmud that there are three things that the Jewish people got through suffering. Torah. When did we get the Torah? After 210 years of slavery in Egypt. Israel. We didn't get the land of Israel until after the 210 years, and then 40 years wandering in the desert. Then we got Israel. And the world to come, the Messianic age, will likewise be preceded by a lot of suffering. And one doesn't have to document that because all of Jewish history is about the suffering of the Jewish people to this day, unfortunately. But then we know what will come out of that suffering is something glorious, something great. So we're not asking for suffering. We don't want another day of it. In fact, the Talmud tells a story of one of the rabbis who was talking about how before Mashiach comes, there will be the birth pains of Mashiach. That means just like a woman goes through horrible pain before she gives birth, we will go through horrible suffering and pain. And he said, I pray that I don't see that age, because I will not be able to handle it. So, was he referring to the Holocaust? Perhaps. Or there were other horrible things that happened before the Holocaust. But nevertheless, that suffering, though it's something that we ask God to minimize, it's something that will lead us to a much greater, glorious good. And therefore, a person, if he wants to absorb Torah, he has to be acceptance of that suffering once it happens. Not ask for it, not bring it about, but accept it once it happens and allow yourself to be cleansed and to be receptive to the Torah. And the 10th one that we'll do today is knowing his place, knowing your place. What does that mean, knowing your place? So there are several ways of explaining it. Number one, a person should not deceive himself or herself. Don't fool yourself about who you are. One of the Hasidic masters once said, who do you think you're fooling? God? You can't fool God. Are you fooling other people? No, you can't fool people. You know, after a while, they'll figure out that you're fooling them. The only one you could fool is yourself. Is it a trick to fool a fool? So you shouldn't fool yourself about who you are. And it goes in both ways, in both directions. Some people feel that they're so gifted, they're God's gift to the world, and no one can compare to them. We all know such people who think that they're everything. No one could come close to them. And of course, that exaggerated sense of self is detrimental, not just to getting along with other people, but it's detrimental to your ability to learn because you think you know everything already. I know it already. There was once a rabbi who was laughing at himself. He was an older man, and he said, I don't have to learn anymore because I know everything. But you know what? I don't have to know anything because I'm famous. And he was mocking himself and saying, you know what? People think they know everything, and therefore they don't have to learn. Well, if you don't learn, you're not going to know anything. So you have to be able to know your place, not exaggerate your own importance. But by the same token, you shouldn't put yourself down and exaggerate your faults. If you always say to yourself, I'm a nobody, and I'm stupid, I'm not going to learn, and I know people like that also, it's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. You cannot knock yourself. You have to know your place. You have to know who you are and what level you're at, and grow accordingly. Because even if you're limited intellectually, you shouldn't think of yourself as being a total idiot, because with effort you will learn. I remember when I was a student teacher in Australia, I had a student who came for the summer to learn. He was an engineer, so he was obviously someone who was accomplished to some extent. He had a master's degree in engineering, and he came to study Talmud, and I was his teacher. And it didn't enter his mind. It just went in one ear, went out the other. I spent a few hours a day teaching him. And this went on for 2 weeks, and we were still on the same page. We made no progress. But you know what he would do? In the hours that he wasn't learning with me, he was reviewing it. And not only that, he would walk. We had lunch in a different location. So he would walk down the street, cross the street with a sheet of paper trying to memorize the words. And it wasn't going in. And if he would keep this up for another day or two, I think I would have gone crazy. I had him for 2 weeks, a few hours every day for 2 weeks. After 2 weeks, his mind opened up and he became the best student. But if he would have convinced himself that I'm an idiot, I'm just stupid, I'm not cut out for studying Talmud, maybe engineering was easier for him. But he never gave up. Even though I was ready to give up, he never gave up. And he became the best student. Because he didn't put himself down. He didn't say, I must be stupid because it's not entering my mind. Rashi, the great commentator, says it means literally that you should have a fixed place to learn. Physical stimuli help us in our learning process. If you keep on moving around from one place to another, it's not conducive to learning. Others say that it means that know your place, meaning know the sources of your knowledge. If someone asks, where did you get it from? I should be able to answer. It says so in the Torah. If you don't know the source, you should look it up. It's always good to know your sources, because the source will tell you whether you're interpreting it right. If you don't know the source, you just have an idea, Could be you're distorting the idea. Maybe the idea is not exactly the way you're presenting it. If you looked up the source, you'd see it's a little different. It happens to me many times that I have an idea and I interpret it a certain way. Then I look up the source and I see that I misinterpreted it because I knew the idea generally, but I didn't know the source. So it's important to know the place where you take the knowledge from, what it is that the knowledge is based on. One other commentator, Midrash Shmuel, he was a disciple of the great Kabbalist, the Arizal, so he gives a mystical explanation that you should know that your place is in a higher world. That even though we're down here in this world, we have a spiritual source. That means we have a greater potential than what we think we have. We may think that our potential is what we are accustomed to thinking it is, but we have to realize that there's always a higher world where our original place is from, and we should never feel satisfied with the knowledge that we have down here, because there's always more that we could reach. And that's knowing your place. And this is true in general about life. We shouldn't look at what's happening in the world. There's a war in Ukraine, very real, but there's something going on spiritually in a spiritual world. Doesn't mean I necessarily know what it is that's going on, but we know that what happens down here is moved by what happens up there. And we don't have too much influence down here. How many of us could just call Putin and tell him to cut it out? It's not going to work. But we do have influence on what happens up there. Our prayers, our study of Torah, our charity, our mitzvahs do affect the world the way it is up there in the higher sphere. So this is talking about the knowledge of Torah, that we have to realize that there's something in a higher realm that gives us greater potential, but it's true about everything in life, that whatever happens in the physical world, there's a parallel experience going on in a spiritual world, and that's the world that we have more influence over. And therefore, we shouldn't minimize the efforts that we undertake to change the world, which seem to have no bearing on the world because they're spiritual things. They have much more power than the physical things. Maybe heads of state could use diplomacy, and they're failing. It doesn't seem that anyone is interested. The Prime Minister of Israel visited Putin. I don't think he got anywhere. I mean, I'm sure Putin told him, yeah, sure, I don't want a war. I want to stop this war, and while he's continuing to do the bombing. So diplomacy doesn't seem to be working, but spiritual diplomacy has a greater chance of succeeding. Any questions?
I was wondering, maybe I probably missed, but the second point where Rashi said have a fixed place to
Yeah.
learn regularly, is that like a physical place?
Yeah. In other words, if you usually sit in one place when you study, it's a good thing to have that same place and not constantly move around. It's not a law that requires that, it's just it makes you more receptive to the knowledge.
Okay.
Any questions in the Zoom? Okay, so we missed a week, so that's why I added another 2. There's 48, and we had 6 weeks. That means 8 a week, but we missed last week because of the funeral. So that's why I added on 2 this week. Instead of 8, we do 10.